So my name's Kevin Shaw, and I've been working as a colorist 30 years now. I did a degree course in photography, film and television. I took a job as a runner in a studio that turned out to be a moving picture company. And that was where I saw my first telecine. And the idea of sort of electronic grading, not even digital in those days, was all analog, but grading without putting your hands in chemicals and working on motion pictures instead of stills. I mean, that was just a dream job. So today, International Colorist Academy, Final Color for grading, and BBC Studios and post-production for, as I say, technology, restoration, consulting, that side of things. Well, so of course, yes. I mean, the answer is big time. Its technology has changed beyond recognition. When I started, we weren't colorists. So when I started out in telecine, you had telecine engineers, and that title was very fitting because most of my colleagues had engineering backgrounds. I was one of the first of a generation of colorists that really didn't come from an engineering background and started to see potential. And it's no coincidence that the first probably 3 years I was predominantly doing music videos. I mean, a lot of music videos. So what are the technological steps that I've seen? Moving from telecine-based corrections to an outboard color corrector. So in my case, the Da Vinci, but there was also the Pogel and Sunburst and things like that. And then the step from analog to digital, which meant that that was when power windows shapes came into it, more sophisticated secondary isolations, those types of things. And repeatability. I mean, in the analog days, I always used to joke because we had this ability to do tape grades, but if you wanted something the way it was on the tape, I would tell them to edit it later, because going through the analog color corrector, it could be, it was never the same as when it was going in. So analog to digital, that was a big one. And then obviously digital hardware to software, that was a big one. The step from SD to HD came in at that time. And then part of the software change meant that we were now grading not just television, but we could now get involved in cinema. And of course that really took the lid off of grading. That was huge. And now we're at another technological. I mean, this is a very exciting time, I think, because I'm pretty certain that in the next 12 months, HDR is going to take off in a big way. Stereoscopic, no, that was never really going to work. 4K, honestly, is there really a need for that? No, that's a whole other conversation. But high dynamic range monitors, that's huge. And everything that goes on a high dynamic range monitor, that's going to need remastering. So there's a huge potential to specialize in that, and that's one of the areas that I'm looking at right now. Well, I'd have to say yes, and I teach those techniques. So you can ask me, what are they? So anybody that's done any of my strategies classes knows that, and I know these are not uniquely my techniques, but I've kind of refined them in my own way. So yes, I'm a big believer in separating what I call the continuity grade from the look grade, and there's a whole range of processes and techniques that are built around that process. And generally speaking, I always say there's two types of colorist. There's a colorist that is very intuitive, very quick on the panels, just kind of does everything really without thinking. Everything's a reflex action. And those colorists, you can always tell those colorists because they hate software upgrades, they hate changing systems, but they're really quick and they get amazing results. So that's one style. And then the other style is where you kind of think about it a little bit more, and instead of trying everything on the panel, you just know that it's going to be that, and you might try 2 or 3 things, but you kind of you prep it in advance. And the reality is everybody's somewhere between those two, but I'm more towards the methodical I'm very strong on concept. I mean, I hate doing things just because it looks pretty. I like to have a good reason for it along the way. So I guess that would be my style, if you were, that it's preconceived and thought through. I'm glad you asked that question. Is it about knowing how to use a particular piece of equipment, or is it about the fundamentals of color? When I was teaching at Da Vinci as director of training there, I became aware that there were a number of people who were very successful colorists, but who pretty much did what they were told. You know, they were directed by a director or a cinematographer, you know, in those days there was always the potential that you could turn around and say, you know, I can't really do that. There needs to be visual effects, or you need to take that to an editor or something like that. Of course, in software, those possibilities have gone away. But again, based on my classes, I feel very strongly that if you have a good, firm basis of color theory and what you have to do to a picture to make it look better, then even if you don't know the color correction system, you can find your way around enough to get good results. And I think that goes further. Even if you only use one system, you get a lot more out of it if you actually understand the principles around which you're working. In other words, you know, I really am not interested in primaries being called black midtones and highlights, or lift, gamma, gain, or, you know, because half the time they're not what they say on the tin, or even if they are what they say, the term itself is ambiguous. And you could have, you know, primaries on two different color correctors, and certainly if you put a color correction in with one and tried to take it out with the other, you'd be left with cross colors and things like that. So so I'm very firmly in the camp that says you really need to understand color theory, and the rest of it is pretty easy. I think, how do you stop being inspired, really? I mean, I think that the thing I know about all the colorists, I've met a lot of colorists over the years, obviously through the training classes and Da Vinci and just working around the world. And the thing I can tell you about every single colorist is they're totally passionate about their job. And they're all inspired by everything. You know, I mean, the movies they watch, the books they read, the music they listen to. Most of us, you know, if we go home at night or if we're at a loose end on the weekend, we're there, you know, dabbling with the color corrector. So I think everything inspires me. I'm a very keen cinema goer. I'm very keen on photography. So I'll browse photographers. I guess that would probably be a significant one for me, photography. But I don't like to copy. Like I say, I'm always looking at what were they thinking, what was the concept, how does that apply to another project. Everything is inspirational. I would give one other tip, actually. So if somebody said, I'm lacking inspiration, what should I do? I would suggest that you sit down in front of a color corrector or something like Photoshop if you don't know it, or any type of image processing program that you don't know, and just play with it, because it takes off the whole intuitive thing, and now you're just trying to see, what does this do, what does this do? And in my experience, that can be very inspirational. You suddenly find, oh, it's got this really cool tool that does something really interesting, and maybe, so how would I do that? You know, how would I do that in some other system or on another image? I do. So I run a class called Popular Looks, or Look Generation, actually now it's just changed. The idea is that there is such a thing as an iconic look. So there are movies that you may have never seen even, that people will say, you know, I was thinking when I was shooting it, or when I was storyboarding it or whatever, I was thinking it would be a bit like Blade Runner or Gone with the Wind or The Matrix or Oh Brother, Where Art Thou or Sin City. I mean, these are what I would call iconic looks that everybody knows what you're talking about. The truth is that everybody probably thinks of them in a slightly different way. I mean, a common one that I always say in the class is, because I go around the class and I say, well, what's an iconic look for you? What if somebody asked you to make it look like? And often you'll get somebody saying Technicolor, black and white. And I'll say, okay, so there's like thousands of Technicolor movies, and I would hazard a guess that very few of them actually look the same, but they are all Technicolor. So there's an essence there of something that you can extrapolate and apply to something else, and it doesn't have to be an exact match. You very rarely are expected to match something with another project, because if you did, you'd have to have a really good reason for it, because what you don't want is people saying, oh, well, it kind of looks like The Matrix. So now you're not really concentrating on this project, you're thinking about another project. So I think that I do try to innovate a look on every job, but it will be influenced by something. And so what I try and do is this concept idea is, what's the concept of the piece, you know? And it doesn't matter whether it's documentary or narrative. There's always an opinion behind it that's driving it. What are the problems with the source material? You know, is it beautifully shot? Is it clipped? Has it got low bit depth? I mean, all of these things I've got to build into my look, because they're going to, I wouldn't use the word limit, but they're going to push me towards one direction. And last but not least is, you know, I'm a colorist. I don't want anything to leave my room that just doesn't look great. So it's got to be aesthetically pleasing. It's got to be conceptually correct, and it's got to tell the story. It's got to make it easier for an audience to understand or appreciate or enjoy the movie. And so those three things, and it's not a single answer for each question. You have to find the one answer that solves all those three problems, and that's where my looks come out of. It's not essential all the time. Although I can't imagine, you know, if you were a DP or a director and you had the opportunity to be working with the colorist, I can't imagine why you would not want to take that opportunity. Because I think our world, our media industry is very much a team program. I think that even if one person's name gets associated with it at the end, it's teamwork. You know, that's how it works. And that's what I like. I mean, I like working with DPs, directors, producers, you know, editors, because they all bring something to the table, and it's this kind of bouncing ideas backwards and forwards that gives you something really special. I can do something that I like, but that's not to say that it's everybody else's cup of tea. And the more people that you can bounce ideas off of, the more rounded your final work becomes. Codecs and color space, yeah, that's a nitty-gritty problem, isn't it? And of course I can't, you know, as a colorist you can't have favorites, because it's outside of your control. And most of the time they don't come to me and say, okay, what do you want us to give you? Because they've already shot it, and they'll just say, okay, well, this is what you're going to get. I'm a big proponent of ACEs, and that especially this year. I mean, I did a little talk at NAB for the Academy around ACEs. I'm a huge fan. I think that the theory of ACEs is something that is well overdue. You know, the idea that you work in a scene-referred manner rather than a display, especially since we know that display technology is going to change at least 2 or 3 times in the next 5 years. It just doesn't make sense to me that we master in a format that we know is going to be obsolete in only a year. So I'm a huge fan of ACEs. It's not that easy to work in all the time, and certainly there are there's extra thought has to go into it, and I don't use it religiously. I suppose my answer to the question, do I have favorites, I would turn it around and I would say that actually I like to not force, but I like to adopt a different methodology according to the project. It's going to be related on, you know, what the time scale is, what the delivery is, what the target market is. You know, if it's going to a festival and that's the end of it, okay, maybe it doesn't require a full-on ACES workflow. If it's a documentary that's of huge cultural or historical interest, I would really be pushing hard on ACES for anything that's got a long term. If it has a wide audience, you know, again, I think ACES is a good workflow. but it's not always possible. And it depends where you're working, depends on your monitoring. There's quite a lot to build into it. I prefer to work from log images. So I've even done projects which are linear in and display linear in and display linear out, and I'll still kind of go through a log process. And my grade structure, if you like, depending on every system has a different word for it, whether it's nodes or layers or channels or scaffolds or whatever you want to call them, typically involves a logarithmic part, a conversion, could be a LUT, could be a grade, and then a linear part, a scene linear part. And of course that is the ACES workflow as well, that you come in, scene linear, you work in that, you go through the RRT, the reference render transform, and at that point you kind of get into the world of display linear. So I've been doing that since before ACES. That's the way that I prefer to work. There's a lot of myths around ACES, and some of them are kind of encouraged a little bit, that to make it sound a little bit easier than perhaps it could be. But the number one reason for using ACES, and I've proved this in I think the last 3 or 4 classes that I've done in this year, is the number one reason for using ACES is the pictures look so great. And not only do they look great, they look great in a way that is pretty hard to accomplish without going through an ACES route. And so on the last day of the last 3 or 4 1-week training classes that I've run, I've always sort of said to people, so we will, because I know not many people are using the workflow. I know that it requires a certain amount of pre-planning, and that's often outside of the realm of the colorist. But I've said, there are certain shots, there are certain types of shots, certain cameras that will hugely benefit just in terms, for no other reason, they just look good. And it's typically where you've got something that has high dynamic range at the capture stage. All right, so one of the hardest things I think for me, I won't say for colorists, but for me, one of the hardest problems I have is when something is captured at quite a high dynamic range, so there's nothing clipping, but that dynamic range doesn't fit comfortably on a Rec. 709 TV screen, for example. And so what happens there is if you want to keep everything, you end up making the picture flat. And of course, that's very much a fashion nowadays. There's a theory that this fashion has come about because people have edited log material and just kind of grown to like the look. And I think there's some truth in that. But I think it's also because people want to preserve everything they captured in the camera, and to do that on a Rec. 709 screen, you have to flatten the image. But if you put that image into ACES so that it's scene referred when you do the grading, if you had a monitor that was of sufficiently high dynamic range, and Dolby have such a monitor, and Sony have such a monitor, and Canon have such a monitor, then it would look fine without you doing any grading to it. I mean, that's a really cool thing. And so what's so great about ACES is you get this huge range, dynamic range, into your grading system, and then you say, well, but I don't have that monitor, so I've got to convert it to another monitor. And the conversion process, this reference render transform, is based on decades of film knowledge. It's based on camera development, digital camera development. Remember, ACES is not a single proprietary system. It's an open source system with at least 60 manufacturers behind it, several hundred color scientists and engineers behind it. And so between them, they've come up with this one RRT. And so it's no coincidence that it makes the pictures look great. And every time I've done these training courses and I've said, I've gone through the class, and I always encourage people to bring their own materials, because I don't like to work with rehearsed materials. And there's always, a problem shot. And I say, well, have a look at this in ACES, and you put it into ACES, and it's like, wow. And you barely breathed on it, and suddenly it's all coming together, So that's the number one reason, is it just looks great. But the other reasons, people say, well, it makes it easier to match cameras. that's a little bit overstated, you know. It does make it easier, but it doesn't match the cameras. I think that's what people think, that making it easier is not the same as all the cameras match. Of course they don't, because they all have different capabilities. It removes the kind of the special sauce a little bit, and it gives you raw images, but you still have to match exposures and lenses and things like that. Another myth is, oh, well, I'll do it in, you know, I'll grade it on a Rec 709 monitor in ACES, and then I'll be able to output P3, Rec 2020, you know, anything that comes out. And of course, again, there's some truth in that, but the reality is it's not anywhere near so simple, because if you've only graded it on a Rec 709 monitor, you have no idea what's happening in the rest of that space. Now, there are ways that you can manipulate the image to kind of get a glimpse of what's happening in the highlights, what's happening in the shadows, but really you're grading it on a Rec 709. In theory, if you wanted this one master that suits everything, the holy grail, you've got to be working in the biggest color space. And today, that's typically you're going to have to be working on a laser projector in excess of 5,000 nits, I would say, to be properly future-proof. But all of these things work, and that is the other great thing about it, is that it is potentially future-proof if you know how to use it. Advice for new colorists. I mean, the first thing is you've got to be passionate. So you want to be looking at what other people are doing. You want to be exposing yourself to as wide a variety of source material, not just motion pictures, but, you know, paintings, photographs, anything you can. So having a wide variety of influences, that's important. I think where possible, you know, try and be in touch with other colorists. And that was really the thinking behind setting up the International Colorist Academy, was that a lot of people don't have that opportunity, particularly in kind of smaller countries where there might only be a handful of colorists and they very rarely speak. So bringing the community together, as you know, coming up, we've got IBC coming up, and we're running a colorist mixer party, which helps to kind of get the community together. So try not to work in isolation. That can just takes longer to learn anything in that. And of course, do a couple of ICA classes. That always helps. I came to the industry a bit late, in my 20s. I did a degree course in photography, film and television. And at that point I was very keen in photography and particularly exhibition printing. And I took a job as a runner in a studio that turned out to be a moving picture company. And that was where I saw my first telecine. And the idea of sort of electronic grading, not even digital in those days, was all analog, but grading without putting your hands in chemicals and working on motion pictures instead of stills. I mean, that was just a dream job. So I set out to do that, and worked in London I was in London until the early 90s at three post houses. And then moved to Italy. I set up a suite in Italy. That was quite fun. And then I moved to Switzerland, did the same thing in Switzerland. Went back to freelancing, came back to this country, went back to freelancing. And that was when really the teaching started to take off. When I was freelancing as a colorist, and I was doing more and more work with Da Vinci, who eventually employed me as their director of training. And I was with them for 5 years, all the way through from the 888 all the way through the 2K plus. And it was a great job, but I felt that they were off track a little bit with their software color corrector that eventually became Resolve, but not after the company had failed. Anyway, so I left them in 2004. Specifically, so like I say, I was a little bit... well, the main reason, honestly, was that I wanted to get back in the chair. You know, once you're a colorist, you miss it. And I wanted to get back in the chair. And with software color correction, by that time was really starting to... It was quite clear that's where everybody was going to go. And so I wanted to get into feature films, because I had done music videos and commercials. I'd done TV series and episodic work. And the one part that I hadn't done was the film work, and that was the bit that most interested me. So I got into feature film grading and software grading. And then in 2009, that was around the time that DaVinci folded and Blackmagic took it on, and they made it quite clear that support and training was not part of their agenda. And so I got together with some of my earlier instructors when I was the director of training at DaVinci, and that was the time that Warren and I put together the International Colourist Academy. And so that kind of built up the training side of it, but I was still working as a freelance colorist. And then, what would it be? Around 2011, I guess, 2011, 2012, I was doing some grading work at BBC Studios and Post-Production, where we are today. And they said, we're going to be moving soon. Would you be interested in building a facility? So I'd built lots of rooms, grading rooms before, and done that type of work. And I had done some consulting on digital intermediate workflows for them previously, which was how they came to ask me this. But the concept of a brand new facility from the ground up, so just floor space, that was just too much fun to turn down. So and I've been here ever since, working on restoration and specifically, but also on the technology side. Since moving them out of Television Center, we've put in Front Porch Archive, we've put in workflow management systems and expanded the services to an end-to-end service. So I do that as well. So today, International Colourist Academy, Final Color for grading, and BBC Studios and Post-Production for, as I say, technology, restoration, consulting, that side of things.